be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to allow the parties, the state specifically, to make its closing argument.
Thank you. So what's being depicted now is one of the first exhibits that we introduced. That is a photograph of Melissa John Wolfenbarger. And that's a photograph that was taken somewhere around 1997, a year before Melissa went missing. In 1998. We know that in 1998 she was 21 years of age. So she's roughly about 20 years old at that point. And even though she hadn't gotten a chance to live a very long life, she was a mother at that point. She was a wife. And what I look at when I see that photograph, I see a smile, but I also see hope. I see hope when I look at that photograph because of what she must have thought about her children, what she hoped for them, the life that she hoped to live. And I think about the 27 years that has passed and how long that is to wait for justice. But that 27 years, that's a long time to experience life. That's a long time to fall down and get up, and fall down and get up. That's time to experience and have memories with your children. Children that don't have a memory of Melissa. Not Joseph, not Christina. That's an opportunity to have and create memories with your grandchildren. That's 3 grandchildren that you heard Christina testify. She's got 3 boys. There's opportunities. That's what was missing. That's what has been missed. That is what has been taken away from Melissa. The opportunity to have a life, to have those experiences. And she deserved that, even if she didn't want to spend it with this defendant. Even if she wanted to leave him, she still deserved to have that opportunity. She was manipulated. She was intimidated. She was abused. And she was coerced to give up her children. I believe that's what the evidence shows. And I can tell you, 27 years later, I would not expect a judge to allow a defendant that battered his wife to be alone with them, to speak to them 6 days after it happened. Roughly 5 or 6 days after they went down to apply for a protective order. 5 to 6 days after the order had no contract was in place, the judge lets her speak along with him. And then on that very same day, I want to dismiss. On that very same day, children go back with mom. And we don't know what was said. We don't know what was said then. We don't know what he said to them. We don't even know if the bruises that were on her from his attack on July 21st, 1990, we don't even know if those had fully healed yet. I can assure you the mental and emotional trauma from that happened. Having to call the police after a period of time in July where we know she had already been abused and experienced abuse. So when we think about domestic violence and we think about being intimidated and coerced, that's what I want you to think about when we look back at that date, July 29th. I believe the evidence shows that she was intimidated. She was able to be coerced, especially after being beaten for a year by this defendant. And I don't believe that she ever intended to give up her children and walk away from her family and her children.
Your Honor, I want to object to counsel's repeated use of "I believe." I can assure you, counsel is not supposed to interject personal opinion.
Understood. Mr. Fawcett has offered to rephrase. Go ahead.
Now, the indictment you'll get will have one count of murder, for the malice, murder, the intent to kill, the intention to kill Melissa John Wolfenbarger. And this is why we're here. From what was found on April 29th, 1999, and June 3rd, 1999. Cole and Melissa Wolfenbarger did his job. Activities within that same vicinity in the wooded area. In a minute from the residence where Christopher Wolfenbarger and Melissa Wolfenbarger lived. And your judge is going to instruct you that you are duty bound to follow the law. And in your consideration of the law, you should consider certain things and certain things you should not consider, such as sympathy for either the victim in this case or the defendant, disagreement with the law, conjecture, dislike of the system, television, public opinion, penalty or punishment. The only thing that you are to decide when you're considering the evidence is whether or not the state has met its burden beyond a reasonable doubt and prove a guilt for innocence of the guilt of this defendant. You should consider the elements of the crime, the law which the judge will give you, the oath that you've taken as jurors, the facts, the case as presented in the form of testimony, video exhibits such as the video of the defendant hiding, audio exhibits such as the audio of the defendant stating that you never looked for her, acknowledging that he took assault, also acknowledging that she was dating someone and seeing someone and staying with someone named Mike. You also consider the credibility of the witnesses. What was it like when they were testifying? How did they answer the questions? You are entitled, and you're the determinant of the credibility of not just the state's witnesses, but also the witnesses that the defendant called. You all consider what the defense is. Now, the defendant doesn't have to present any defense. Walk into court Tuesday, Wednesday, say, hey, make improvement. But that's not what happened in this case. The defense in this case is Carl Patton. Listen to the theory, the opening statement. Defense in this case is Carl Patton killed Melissa Wolfenbarger. Other than the fact that evidence came in that Carl Patton committed murders, what other piece of evidence or fact, anything that you've heard during the course of this week, what points to that? What other fact would allow you to create that evidence? Other than the fact that he killed someone, the evidence came in, Melissa didn't even know about it. The only thing that's come in about the relationship between the Pattons and their children is that they appear to love each other. It's not so unbelievable. Based off of the letters that Melissa wrote, cards that she wrote, times that she wanted to take her father, Carl, and her mother, Norma, out to lunch. Those are going to be back in the room with you for you to observe and look at while you deliberate. This case is just simply not about Carl Patton as much as they want it to be. This case is about domestic violence. This case is about intimidation. This case is about loss of control. The loss of control that this defendant had over the custody of his children and over Melissa. No matter how much they want this case to be about Carl Patton, this case has nothing to do with Carl Patton, other than the fact that he asked law enforcement to find his daughter. Why does Norma go to the residence of Kathy Wolfenbarger looking for Melissa, raising attention to that issue if they're responsible for it? Now, a lot of facts have come to evidence in this case. I would ask you to put weight on more the facts that have been corroborated, like that. You heard that from Norma, and you don't have to just take Norma's word for it because you heard that from Christina. She does not have a lot of memories from her childhood. She doesn't have a memory of her mother, but she remembers that day. Because that stood out in her. Where is my daughter? I could just imagine how that was. It wasn't a calm statement. It was screaming, where's my daughter? that's why you should believe that happened. And that's why that theory is just plain ridiculous. He killed Melissa Wolfenbarger. Most importantly, your common sense is the main thing that we're asking you to use in the side of this case. What does the evidence tell you? What do the facts tell you? What has been presented? Judge is also going to charge you on what reasonable doubt is and what it is. Judge is going to charge you that the state is not required to prove the doubt or the guilt of the defendant beyond all doubt or for mathematical certainty. Reasonable doubt is a doubt of a fair-minded and impartial juror honestly seeking the truth. Is a doubt based on common sense and reason. It does not mean a vague or arbitrary doubt, like Carl Patton. A arbitrary, not supported by the facts, thrown out, hoping to stick on the wall. Evidence may be direct or circumstantial, or both. Considering evidence, you may use your reasoning and common sense to make deductions and reach conclusions. May be direct or circumstantial. Direct evidence is that which may be seen or heard. Otherwise, direct sense. So when Christina says, I saw Norma show up to the residence in a panic looking for her daughter, that's direct evidence of her observations. And from that recollection, the testimony of Norma, you could infer that Norma was sincere when she was looking for her daughter. The types of inferences that you can infer from the facts that have been presented. And then we have the circumstantial evidence. This is exactly what I was referring to. We got direct evidence of tool marks on bones that were recovered and identified as the remains of Melissa Wolfenbarger. Tool marks are direct evidence. Those are observations. You'll have those that you will be able to review and look at while you deliberate. You also have direct evidence that the defendant was in possession of assault. Two separate facts. Now you wouldn't, and we wouldn't walk into court on Wednesday and ask you to convict because there are tool marks on the bones and remains of Melissa Wolfenbarger. And we wouldn't ask you to walk in here on Wednesday when we started presenting evidence to convict this defendant of murder because he was in possession of assault. Can you draw logical, common sense conclusions from that? That's just one piece of the evidence that has been presented, which you were able to do that. We had saw around the same time that the wife was missing, or the wife's remains were located. The medical examiner says there's the saw that we presented is Exhibit 66 is consistent with the type of marks that could be made by that instrument. And in his own statement that he was in possession of it around that time, and then the statement of the rocks, although they were reluctant to say so, that they never got that saw back. We would not ask you to convict solely based on that fact alone, but that is a fact that you can consider, and those are inferences that you can draw. Reasonable, common sense inferences. So this is what I saw when I woke up this morning. I probably see this a lot more than most people, but when I woke up, this is what I saw. And I had time, so I stopped by to get some gas. And by the time I finished, I got back and I crunk up my car, and I'm back on full. So I never saw anything going to my vehicle, but during that period, I smelled what appeared to be gas because I cut grass. I smelled gas. There's about there's less money in my account. The numbers on the dial are different. I hear a clicking sound. And so, even though I never saw any gas going on my vehicle, there are logical deductive conclusions that I would draw from all those facts and circumstances. Nobody's going to be able to come in and tell me that Santa Claus put gas in the vehicle. So when we ask you to use your common sense and look at the facts, The evidence is what it says it is. The facts are what they are. In the count of murder, you'll get the indictment. You'll see that it's charged that the defendant with malice aforethought caused the death of Melissa Wolfenbarger by inflicting homicidal violence. Now, as it's charged, that term homicidal violence, based on the manner in which the remains were recovered, it is impossible for the medical examiners to determine if she was shot, if she was strangled, if she was stabbed, any number of ways that you could commit a murder could have been committed to Melissa Wolfenbarger. But you can't tell if someone has been strangled if their neck is missing. You can't tell if they're stabbed or shot in their torso if there's no torso. And what we're able to determine based on the testimony of the medical examiner is that the facts and circumstances which she observed as how the remains were located, the history and evidence of domestic violence in that relationship, the fact that there's evidence that someone removed her limbs with salt, all of those facts, and the fact you heard her testify that in her medical opinion, her expert opinion, she did not believe that Melissa Wolfenbarger died of natural causes. All those are facts that point to homicidal violence. In her opinion, was that it was more likely that Melissa Wolfenbarger died from homicide. That was her opinion. And that's why the indictment is charged like that, is because of how she was found. But that does not take away from what we have proven based on the testimony. And that is that she died from being murdered. That is called homicide. Judge is going to charge you with the law of malice. It is not ill or hatred. It is just simply a killing without justification, excuse, or mitigation. It can be expressed, deliberate intention to unlawfully take a life of another person, and it may be implied with no considerable provocation appears, and all the circumstances of the killing show an abandoned and malignant heart. I submit to you the facts and the circumstances of this case, and all the facts and circumstances of this case point to that conclusion as the only reasonable conclusion, that this defendant did in fact commit malice murder on the person of Melissa Wolfenbarger. The state does not have to prove premeditation to prove murder, regardless of how briefly that malicious intent existed. Malice may be formed in an instant. And if malice was in the defendant's mind at the time of the killing or act and moved the defendant to do it, that is enough for the killing to be murder. The state does not have to prove motive to prove murder. Any evidence of motive is for use to determine the defendant's state of mind at the time of killing. You are allowed to consider it, such as the evidence of domestic violence is lawful evidence of motive. Did he abuse her that year? Did he hit her? Did that happen multiple times that year? That's what the facts have shown. You can use that and those facts and the expert testimony from the domestic violence expert as evidence of the defendant's motive. And all of those things I previously mentioned, the fact that there's an open criminal case that she wasn't able to appear to. The fact that she was seeing someone else. The fact that she planned on leaving, that she had continually left him throughout that year. All of that is evidence of motive. The judge is also going to tell you that the testimony of a single witness, if believed, is sufficient to establish a fact. There's no legal requirement of corroboration of the witness, provided you find the evidence to be sufficient. That means if, when you heard the testimony of Christina and you believed it, you don't need any corroboration for that to be a fact that you consider. That means if you heard the testimony of Christina and you believed her when she said that this defendant would always talk about go on a run. When we talk about how to get rid of everybody, who says that to his daughter, considering how her mother was found? Now, that's after he says that after Melissa Wolfenbarger's remains had been identified. He makes those statements. That's what she remembers growing up. Does that? This defendant. This case went through several detectives that basically continued to work on this case. Detective Calhoun and Detective Shepard. Even through the retirement of Detective Calhoun, he continued to work with Detective Shepard until the cold case unit was created, and then 3 years later you have this indictment. So from Detective Kelly, when we're talking about this skull is found, to the point where Norma Patton goes to Henry County, and Detective Stott really is the first investigator that starts to really investigate and look for Melissa as a missing person in Henry County. He wasn't able to get a lot of traction with the Atlanta Police Department at that point in '99. We have Detective Stott, who interviewed the defendant. Back during that period, it's before 2003, he says, March, April, '99, last time he saw her alive. And you have Detective Calhoun being assigned the case in 2003 when her remains are identified. And then when he retires, you have Detective Shepard, and he works with Stein to do some additional testing. And Detective Stott testified that he was one of the first persons to begin the missing persons investigation. And that's when the defendant, when he interviewed, told him that the last time he saw Melissa was in March of '99. And we know that from the subsequent statement in 2021 when he met with Detective Shepard, that's not exactly what he said. He says it was around December of 1998. The only difference between when he makes that statement before 2003, that he saw her in '99 in March, and in 2021 is Melissa's remains have been identified. We know that the remains were located right by his job. And I submit to you that there's a reason why those two statements are inconsistent. That's his line. Detective Calhoun spoke with the defendant. Once the remains were identified, suspected the defendant once the remains were identified, and also began to look into the history. Because the first thing they do in homicide investigations, they look at what was the victim's life like. First thing he saw was, well, there's evidence of domestic violence. And what also stood out is the location of where Melissa's remains were found. We know that from the testimony, Melissa and Chris, the defendant, lived in this area by Brookline Street. We know that Action Glass is right here. And here's the junkyard. So we know that the head was across the street from Action Glass. And we know that the extremities are virtually right next door to Action Glass in this wooded area. So, make no mistake, everyone's a suspect, but at this point, all of the evidence is pointing in this direction, to this defendant. What is the evidence against this defendant? So, there's a timeline of abuse in this case that was presented. We'll go back to the beginning of '98. You know, the testimony of Carl Patton was that Melissa started working with her, I believe it was the Virginia Highland Waffle House, somewhere around the end of '97. So they were working together, sometimes on the same shift at the beginning of 98. And there was one point when Tyner remembered seeing marks around the neck of Melissa Wolfenbarger. What she described appeared to show that marks of someone's hand around Melissa's neck. Immediately, the overseas defendant went after the front. And that's when he got into the altercation with Troy McClendon. That's what you heard from the testimony of Team Patton. That's the beginning of 1998. And we get to July of 98. And so this is what Detective Calhoun is looking at as he's beginning to investigate the case. He's looking at the location of remains and where they lived at, his job, and he's looking at all this information. All the evidence is pointing at this defendant. There's a police report that's created where the officer observes bruising and marks on the person, Ms. Wolfenbarger, Melissa. After that, he directs her. The defendant isn't there. He doesn't wait around. After that, he directs her to go report him, take out a protective order, get you some protection from him. And that's exactly what she did. She went down there in person and applied for a protective order. So those are the records that Detective Calhoun had access to. This is a day after that July incident, July 21st. So the next day, July 22nd, she goes to the courthouse and petitioner seeking relief from family violence. From him. That's who she was seeking relief from. She was seeking relief from the choking that she had and her sister observed, that Troy fought him about. And then we had that Rule 9 side setting it down from the 29th, and then we have that where the judge allows her to speak with this defendant. Just days after that. Days after her hair is being dragged and pulled. Days after she's being hit. And then that happens. It wasn't just what Tyner said. It wasn't just what Marlon Sutton said about what he observed. There's another person who saw that abuse. Dorothy. Jones, Cooley Jones. Dorothy Cooley. She lived in that area. She had known the defendant before she met Melissa. And remember seeing a day where Melissa had shades on and a black eye. When we talk about testimony of the domestic violence expert about humiliation, isn't that humiliating? Walking around with yet another bruise, another mark, another scratch. Sitting up here talking about skin conditions. That's not a skin condition, that's a black eye. You should be offended by them talking about skin conditions and kind of pawn that off as reasons why people saw marks on her. Tina didn't see a skin condition. These marks from this defendant's hand around her neck, that wasn't a skin condition. That was bruising for being choked. The black eye wasn't a skin condition. He punched her in the eye. It's not a skin condition. Thomas Dixon. All the witness statements line up perfectly on top of each other. The witnesses that observed the abuse during the issue. This is at the end of the year. So we go from 10 at the beginning of 1998. We go from Dorothy. We go to July, Officer 7. Then we get to the end of 98, and she's still being abused because she's still going back and forth between Dixon and this defendant. She's still talking about the abuse. is at the end of the year. Last time he sees her is in December. She's being whooped, intimidated, coerced, bruised, punched, dragged down the street the entire year of 98. And I submit to you, that's not the first year it started. It didn't just start in 98. You can infer that this has been going on for a while. Not just 98. Dixon confronted the defendant after he came to the Waffle House at the end of that year. You gotta leave. You gotta go. What did Dixon see? Them talking, Melissa crying. Kind of like that July 29th day at the courthouse. Them talking, Melissa crying. Then we got investigator over here. You heard testimony that from the mother. The DA's office went to interview the defendant's sister a year before that happened. He knew from that the DA's office was still conducting an active investigation into the death, murder, disappearance of his missing, murdered wife. So make no mistake about it. When you know what? That had already happened the year before. He knows exactly why the police are at the front of his house. Oh shit. It's hit the fan. He's hiding for 30, 40 minutes. Come out. He's right here. Let's see the video. There he is. Come on out, buddy. Gig is up. He had 27 years. It's up. Hide it. And doesn't it look like what you saw? Doesn't it look like it was planned? It didn't look like it was his, oh, no. It looks like he planned to go there. Got there real quick, went out there, and sat out there for what, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. It's the police. Go hide. Guilty. Detective Shepard. You picked up this investigation. Had those same suspicions. Calhoun had all the evidence is pointing to this defendant. But I'm going to interview Chris. See what he has to say. Let's see if his statement is inconsistent. Well, he admits to being fired because the Rock thought he stole the salt. Well, that's interesting. Admitted that he borrowed it. That's interesting. He admitted that him and Melissa were having problems. Admitted that Melissa was seeing and staying with a guy named Mike. Admitted that he did not look for his wife. Well, here's the thing. Even if he still has 2 young children, very young children. Even if him and Melissa had planned on going their separate ways, wouldn't you think that at some point he'd want to be able to tell his children that he looked for their mother? Wouldn't you think that? Wouldn't you think at some point, for his children's sake, he would have tried to look for their mother? That is a fact I think you should consider, because you look at all those pictures of Six Flags. What is he trying to say? He's a good father? No, he's not. He didn't look for their mother. And you can take your kids to Six Flags every day. That does not take away from the fact that you didn't do what you were supposed to do. One, you should have abused her. You should have intimidated her. You shouldn't have punched her. You shouldn't have grabbed her hair and dragged her. You shouldn't have murdered her. That's not a good father. And then you have that statement that he made to the detective. Detective Shepard, and I want you to hear this. says about his efforts to look for his wife, and what he says about his knowledge that she was going to leave him, the problems that they were having, and the knowledge that she had about Mr. Dixon.
Battery 60%. Connected to DHEL 5490 and DHEL 540039F10.
I mean, before that, I mean,
Where was she working?
at that time, the Waffle House up in, like, where that was the middle of the street corner there.
Where was she working?
At the glass company around the corner.
All right, so when was the last time you saw Melissa?
And that's the thing, you know, I don't quite remember if the last time was, because I remember, like, she would come and go, okay? And we say that it wasn't like, we're happy-go-lucky, she's sitting right here one day and then she was up and gone. And I don't know if that's the way.
So would you describe your relationship as tumultuous or like on again, off again? You know,
It was rocky there towards the end, mainly I think because it was her family so far trying to get back in her head and trying to make her think things and do things. And
like what?
man, she never had a relationship with her sister at all. You know, and then there towards the end, you know, I guess everybody has a need for one, you know, a family and want to feel love and want that type of thing. You know, and I think there towards the end, maybe she tried a little to try to get back with him or to do or what. But I don't think it was near what they made it seem like, that she was there all the time or she leaving cards or pictures. And I know that did happen sometimes when she did, you know, at that time, but the struggle that we had a common goal of what we were trying to accomplish. You know, we had several bumps in our road.
Which was to go to California.
This is a good
Where
way.
was the kids at and all that?
She was like, my mom. She didn't want Norman in the house. She didn't want her to be raised like she was living right there. There was no, you know, we knew that her names were bad and anybody was feeling right there in the.
Okay, so when was the last time you saw her?
But the last actual time I remember was like, I woke up and she was gone. Like we were in the middle of the night and she left. And I don't know if that was the last time or the last time when I dropped her off at the train station to go to work. If it was the exact. I don't
Do
really.
you remember telling Detective Calhoun that the last time you saw her, you were driving up to your house on Brookline and saw her walking down the street? And that was the last time that you saw her.
I don't know what they're saying now, but it's possible.
Okay.
I just don't.
So that, basically you said that was the last time you saw her, and she said she was going to a train station. Something to that effect. I'm not saying verbatim that's what you said, but it was something along those
It's
lines.
possible. I'll give you that.
But does that sound like it's accurate?
Again, it could be. I don't know.
But you remember that incident, or can you recall that happening almost about to be home, driving up and her walking down the road? Does that ring any bells?
I mean, that's usually the way it happens because we only had one car.
Okay.
You know, if there
She
was,
would walk to the train station to try to go to work or something?
you know, or I give her a ride, or she, you know, sometimes she just wanted to walk. You know? We're not talking about the train station far away. We're talking about from here right to the end of the road.
Right. Yeah, I know. Within the city, so I understand. But talking about that specifically, do you remember that day specifically?
I don't know. One.
Did you remember?
One is that relevant?
Well, I would like to ask you, what was she wearing? Do you remember? Did she have a purse with her? You know?
I can't remember.
So you don't, the last time you saw her, when you came back home and she wasn't there, where was her stuff? She didn't have a car, she couldn't move her, so it was still there in the house?
I would assume. I mean, if she left and stuff like that, it was only like just a small. I mean, kind of the same thing I did. I mean, when Austin Drive we moved, my grandparents was going to sell the house and everything. You know, when I left, I didn't take part of nothing. I was going to live with my uncle. So whatever little.
So after the last time you saw her, or that when she left, did she tell her family? Did she tell your family? Did you tell her that your wife left?
I mean, she had left many times before that. When she would leave and go, I never knew that was the last time I was going to see her. If I did, I would have, you know, freaking kept perpetrating.
After that, like a month or two, you could think that was.
You know, after a while, I was thinking that she had split and moved on. I mean, there was, you know, she was maybe seeing the guy and everything that was up there, or I know that she was living with in Buford, or no, I can't remember the last one was Buford or Peachtree Corners.
Was she seeing somebody?
I don't know if she was seeing somebody, but there was this dude, and I want to say his girlfriend, that sometimes that she would stay with him in like an econo lodge out that way.
And how did she know this?
She worked with him.
Worked with the girl or the guy?
I want to say the guy and the girl both worked there, but I could be wrong. I know the guy worked there, but I know that it was a couple, you know, because then there was this one time that they had called me and said that they were moving and she had to go do something, and she had to do something else.
And this was before the last time you saw her, right?
Well, that's
That's what I'm saying. I'm just wondering.
all that was.
I'm not misunderstanding you.
Right.
I'm not trying to trick you or confuse you.
No,
I just want you to remember.
I'm trying to figure it out.
Like if you were there, I was. So that's why I'm terrified. I'm not trying to remember. I just want you to be accurate. All right, so a year goes by, you still don't tell anybody that she's gone.
I mean, I'm figuring that she's already done. I mean, we were always talking about changing it and doing all. And she had the stuff there.
Right.
You know, and she got to the point where she was unhappy with me. I'm not trying to push myself in anybody's life that doesn't want me there. I mean, look at my daughter and everything that's going on there. I haven't tried to push. And, you know, maybe looking back at everything now, I was wrong. All the way around with both of them. Maybe I should try to push more and try to do it, but.
You said you lost your job back then. Your job, the last time you wanted to leave your job.
Man, this guy, now, there's a lot of things going on right there with that. But, and I do now the same thing pretty much I did then. I mean, I work on Wolfenbarger and things on the side. And there was a guy that, I don't know who stole the thing, but there was a saw that was missing. And I can tell you the exact guy that I borrowed this tool from and everything to, I didn't steal their saw. Period.
Why did they buy it?
Because he said I stole a saw. Because the saw was missing, and I lived around the corner, and he drove past my house, and he seen the back of the Volkswagen right there, the top was cut off.
So he thought because you cut something off the car.
You know, and I flat out said, look, I don't know anything about it. You know, and then there was that, and then there was something where I drove through the Coal Plaza thing on 400. You know, there was just a bunch of little things, and that was just the last straw.
How did you go to the Coal Plaza?
You know, there used to be a thing where you could go through it.
Right.
You know, and I was under the understanding. Yeah.
Okay.
I was under the understanding that, you know, there was a thing with painful, or there was just a bunch of little things. And that was just the last straw. There was no big deal, there was no.
They just let you go.
Right.
They didn't file insurance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I didn't do it. And you know, if that goes there where I borrowed the I tried to tell them whatever, but I said the last straw, yeah.
Did you ever go up to the Waffle House and get an altercation in the mail there?
I don't remember. I saw that on the internet. I don't remember that.
The guy said he came up there and he beat you up.
And it seems like I would remember that, but I don't, you know.
You drive a yellow Volkswagen?
I never had yellow, no. What?
Never yellow.
Never. Nope. I've never had yellow. I had a thing against yellow cars. sense about it. It has to go back. If her parents didn't do it directly, it had to be something indirectly around them. I beat my brain.
So when you found out that a body was found just around the corner from where you were, and that the body had been dismembered with assault,
I didn't know that the body was dismembered with assault at all.
you know the body was dismembered?
I heard that. Nobody ever said assault. I didn't hear about that.
Autopsy report.
Nobody ever gave me an autopsy. Nobody said that to me. I didn't know that. It was on the internet. Honest to God. I mean,
So what motive would her family have to kill?
to me it sounds strange that they got away with this stuff for all these years, and then all of a sudden, right as we split up and doing this right there, then all of a sudden he ended up guilty. I don't know if she came to them needing money, or
Do you think it's likely that her own family murdered her up and cut her up?
man, her own family killed her family and friends.
Yeah, I know he committed murder, but that's...
So his family and friends.
Why would he kill her? What would be the motive for
Hey
that?
man,
He's involved in, your family's involved in criminality, and you're trying to protect yourself from going to jail. That's a motive to kill someone. What motive would he have to kill her?
well, we knew what he did. Her dad was like one of our.
So you weren't worried about him coming after you? I mean, he's going to cut up his own daughter and cut you up.
How would he come after me? I didn't do anything. I didn't come in. Here's what I'm saying, okay? I don't know if she needed money or it may have come to him and threatened him in some way, and and they did it. Maybe they were drunk. It's one thing that I don't know. But anything I say at this point is speculation because I don't know. But I feel like the hell, if there's serial killers that have killed their family and friends and something happens to their family, okay, first of all,
Serial killers operate those kind of... Okay.
let's say about this, okay?
Well, I'm not here to talk about, I'll deal with their family and
Right.
speculation.
Well, let's look at the facts. Facts. You said that she was put in bags, right? Well, that's what it says on the internet, that she was
This
in
is a lot. I didn't say that.
So was she put in bags?
Well, I said that.
Look, we're being straight up with you. I'm trying to help you out. I'm trying to
What I
figure this out.
understand, but what I understand, the body parts had washed out of an area onto the street. Now, there were bags recovered there, so if you make the assumption that they may have been in bags, yeah. But I wasn't there to see, so I can't.
Nobody has been straight up with me on this, okay? And everything that I'm learning is basically through the internet. And we all know how the internet lies, and it's a whole
I
thing.
agree with you 100%.
Everything that the internet says about me, living under a different name, trying to hide, and it's definitely a lie.
And that's why I'm not asking you about that, because I'm not going to go off on speculation from the internet.
Throughout the trial, you heard from the testimony of Dr. Rosa James. She was a domestic violence expert. She had hundreds of experiences with persons that have been victims and perpetrators of domestic violence. She was able to tell you about some of the cycles of abuse, talking about the tension building. The beginning of 1998, we talked about the incident, the different phases where there's an incident, then there's a reconciliation, and then there's calm. And so ultimately, what we have from the beginning of 1998, when Melissa starts working with her sister, we have a representation of what that expert was talking about. We have the tensions, we have the incident, we have the reconciliation, I'll call that July 29th, and then we have the subsequent calm until we have the disappearance of Melissa. And I would submit to you that testimony of the expert, of Dr. James, is relevant testimony. It's testimony you can and should consider in evaluating what's been presented in evidence of domestic violence. And I would ask you to put the appropriate weight on her testimony and use that in your determination. Dr. Mark Gilbo is an anthropologist with a specialization in skeletal remains and analysis of skeletal remains. He was able to say he observed saw marks on the remains of Melissa Wolfenbarger. And as far as the exhibits that he was able to go over, Exhibit 34, which you'll have, you see the example here where he's talking about the part of the bone that had been shaved down. And you have the next exhibit, the autopsy of the remains of Melissa Wolfenbarger. You see where the saw marks are that were indicated by Dr. Gilbo, what he observed. And then you have the ridges here, where it also appears that there's some type of mechanical saw or device that is being used to dismember the remains of Melissa Wolfenbarger. I'll submit to you, those are facts and evidence, along with the fact that this defendant was in possession of the saw, the fact that this defendant borrowed the saw from his job, the fact that this job never got the saw back. Those are all facts that you can consider. Those are all logical, common sense deductions that you can draw. But in the testimony of Dr. Terry, you heard about the analysis and testing, in particular by the swabbing of Norma's mouth, the analysis of the dental records, and that ties directly into the additional analysis and tests that Detective Stein did when he documented Detective Shepard. And we have that additional testing where, even though it didn't result in anything useful, Detective Stein was able to retrieve the bags and submit them for additional testing. And I submit to you that those bags were outside for who knows how long. I submit to you that there was evidence that the head had been moved. I submit to you that George McEachran encountered that bag along with his daughter. I'll submit to you that Tina Miller, Wolf County Medical Examiner's Office, responded to that location along with Detective Kelly and the Atlanta Police Department. And even though that did not result in useful information, the process is important because it's important to cross every T and dot every I. And in this investigation, that's a part of the process, and I submit that to you. And at this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to sit down. The defense will have an opportunity to address you with their arguments. I will submit to you that this case is not about the family of Melissa Wolfenbarger. This case is about the tumultuous relationship between this defendant and our victim, Melissa. He wasn't able to control her, and when he lost control, he murdered her. That's what the evidence has shown. And at the conclusion of the case, after the judge charges you on the law, when I ask you to vote the truth, and that's guilty on that count of murder, and this is that.
Thank you. Mr. McDerman, does the defense wish to make a closing statement?
Yes,
Closing
Your Honor.
argument? Thank you.
Just a short word about how this works. The state gets to split their argument. So they'll make an argument, I get to make an argument, they get the last word too. Okay, the first word, last word, and I won't get to rebut that. That's just the way it is. We accept that. You've all taken an oath. And you've taken an oath, the judge will instruct you in just a minute. Not my words, not their words. The law that will require you to decide this case based on evidence. Based on evidence. You remember in my opening statement, I told you that the state has got gaping holes in its case. And that the state is going to give you bits and pieces of evidence. And that it is going to tell you a story to fill those in the way that suits them. And it's going to ask you to imagine along with them that that story is true. And it's going to ask you to make a leap of logic at the end from alleged instances of abuse to murder. And I have asked you to follow your oath, to follow the law, to decide the case based on the evidence, not on the imagination. Let's talk about the evidence a little bit. You've been told about the difference between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. I won't rehearse the story, the lesson. What hard evidence exists in this case? I will submit to you that not one bit of direct evidence in this case points to that man right there. Not one. I'm not saying there's no direct evidence in this case. There's lots of it. There is obviously the remains. There is the manner in which those remains were recovered. We had the head discovered in the street on April 29th. We're not exactly sure how it got there. One detective thinks there was a great rain event that washed it out. Another one says there was a dog. We don't know. And then about a month later or so, they discovered several bags in the wooded lot behind the trucking business. Some people call it a junkyard. Come back to that. The medical examiner eventually is able to identify the skull using dental records, dental charts. And notes that there are tool marks, of course, on the body parts. After some time goes by, we also know that there was a search of Christopher's former residence. There was lots of evidence taken from this. Lots of evidence that came from the remains. As we've talked about before, there were paint chips in the hair. There were human hairs, apparently not Melissa's. There were pubic hairs. It was a pubic hair. There was DNA evidence. There were carpet fibers. There's lots of evidence. And you heard the detectives sit there and tell you, we specifically sent this off for testing. Some of it more than once. Whoever's hair that was in there that wasn't Melissa's was also not his. Whoever's pubic hair that was also not his. Wherever those paint chips came from, it was not from his residence. Someone says, oh, it was remodeled. It may have been remodeled, but folks, when you paint over paint, the old paint's still under there. And you go scrape a paint sample, you're going to get all of it. None of it matched. There was luminol evidence. They sprayed the entire house, not a drop. And finally, the more modern DNA taken from the bag. You heard Detective Stein sit there and talk about the event where they went out with all the media to the site, looked at the proximity to where Christopher had worked. You heard him testify about the DNA in the bags, and he read the results of those reports. Yes, we found DNA. Yes, there was a viable profile that represented 5 people, two of whom at least were male. And they submitted Christopher's DNA sample. They went up specifically again to get new DNA from him and submit it for that test. That was in 2022 or so. Christopher willingly submitted. Yeah, he knew the DAs were still investigating him. He didn't run from it when they called him and said, hey, we'd like to get your DNA. he submits it, and you heard the results of the test. Christopher Wolfenbarger is excluded from being a contributor. Well, that's when we hear this theory about there was a great rain flood event. I gave this page from the weather reports. The National Climatic Data Center for the City of Atlanta in April of 1999. I gave it to Detective Shepard. And you saw him pretend he couldn't. Or I believe it was Don gave it to the detective. And you saw him pretend, oh, I'm not comfortable reading this. This document's going to go back with you into evidence. And you all can look at it. And if there's a single one of you who can't figure it out, I would be shocked. The days go down here, the days of the month, the hours of the day go this way, and at the end there's a cumulative total of the rainfall for each day. And you'll be able to look at this document and see that on that day, the other deputy who said there was an intermittent mist was correct. There was roughly a quarter of an inch of rain for the entire day. And most of it appears to have fallen at about 3 o'clock in the morning, long before that had appeared on the road that day. And you can look up the rest of the way. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Detective Shepard, oh, it rained so much that month. No, it didn't. They analyzed the carpet fibers. They could find no match to Christopher's house. So then we're told about the circumstantial evidence. It's interesting to me that you just heard the district attorney tell you all the facts and evidence in this case point to one man. But he's not talking about this hard evidence, is he? Because there's a bunch of that, and not a single bit of it points to this man. All of it points away from this man. But Detective Shepard, or maybe it was Detective Calhoun, one of the two, got on the stand and said, there's only been one suspect in this case from day one. Well, when the results keep pointing away and pointing away and pointing away, maybe there should have been a different one. Maybe you should have asked some more questions of the neighbors or of the family. You heard the district attorney here tell you. That's how we conduct investigations. We look at the person's life. We want to find out what's going on in their life. They never investigated that family. They never investigated anybody else. Where are the records of the test of paint chips for a single other person's house? Where are the records for a search warrant from a single other individual's house? Where are the search warrants getting hair or pubic hair or DNA from anybody else in this investigation? Crickets. Because they want to tell you a story about domestic violence. I'm a supporter of Me Too. Domestic violence is a real thing. You've heard the district attorney tell you multiple times now. This is a case about domestic violence. It may have that question in it somehow. Certainly it does. It is an issue you're going to have to decide. You're going to have to decide how much weight to attribute to those alleged incidents. And you're going to have to decide, as a fact finder and determiner in this case, how it fits into the overall picture. But this is not a case about domestic violence. This is a case in which a man is charged with an act of murder. And the state has not given you one single instance or bit of evidence about an act of murder. They want to get you sympathetically on the board. After he tells you, don't judge this by sympathy. But then he wants to tell you all these violent instances, and he wants to embellish them. He punched her. That's not in the evidence anywhere. He beat her all the time for the whole year. That's not in evidence anywhere. And they want to tell you that story and then ask you to make the leap to there must have been some act of murder also. What about these instances of domestic violence? We heard from first about the July 1998 incident. Yes, there's a police report. We had a police officer testify. He told you he did not look under her clothing. How could he have known if there were scrapes on her back or backside? He told you that. I didn't look at that. We get home and Norma says, well, I got home with her and she had scrapes all down her backside. Just after she had gotten done telling me that she was wearing blue jeans. I'm not sure how you get scrapes if you fall on the ground with blue jeans on. You have reports from Tina. Tina says she came in there with choke marks on her neck. And there was another guy named Clinton who stood up for her. None of that story is corroborated by anybody else anywhere. The only person who's ever told that story is Tina Patton. Tina says she took Melissa back up to Chris's house on Brookline and confronted Christopher. But Christopher tells Detective Stott in his interview that he didn't like Melissa staying with her sister, because she got her into cigarettes and also was doing meth. Not necessarily that Melissa was doing it, but that he didn't like Melissa around that stuff. Well, I think there would be a confrontation when she brought her up there. We've heard from Mr. Dixon about domestic violence. It is funny to me. You should find it incredible that when he gives an interview in 2003 to the police about Melissa, he does not one time mention abuse, marks on her body, being drugged on the sidewalk, her complaining about her husband. He does not mention it one single time in an hours-long interview. And suddenly, when they find him at the last minute before trial, they find out he's been watching true crime shows about this, and suddenly he remembers this incident where she had bruises and she was drugged on the sidewalk. The testimony is not credible from a former Waffle House employee and bank robber, Mr. Dixon. You heard evidence from Miss Cooley. Lived across the street. She seemed to be confused about a lot of her facts and details. Testimony was difficult to follow. But she says, oh yeah, I heard screaming and breaking glass over there all the time. There was apparently no glass left in the house at some point. Definitely from that house. Definitely that house where Chris lived. And I know that because that's the house I went in and cleaned. I cleaned all the houses that Mr. Holyfield owned. Who's Mr. Holyfield? Holyfield didn't own that house. You heard testimony from several people. That house was owned by Christopher's parents. Miss Cooley was never in there. I think Miss Cooley's confused as to what she's talking about. Oh, well, I definitely saw a black eye behind the glasses. then she said a few moments later, I only saw her passing a few times when she was getting in the car to go to the grocery store. Never talked to her, just said hi. Testimony about Saul. Oh, he had access to a sawzall. Well, their memory seems to be just as cloudy and hazy as a lot of people. And this is a 26-year-old case, that's understandable. But I look at the statements that were made, and I see at least 4 different versions of that story that have been told. In the original detectives' reports, they said a saw went missing while Chris worked there. And we thought it was Chris. We blamed Chris. And we never found him. And then later it turned into he stole a saw. And then later they backed off and said, well, no, he asked to borrow a saw, and we never gave it back. You heard them. Their own witness, they had to impeach him by playing things that were in audio because they said they didn't even remember saying that. And they testified here that he took a saw, not saying he stole it, whatever. And she didn't even remember talking to me a couple weeks before that, before trial. She didn't remember telling me on the phone that, yeah, he brought it back. My apologies. Circumstantial evidence about alleged conflicts in Christopher's statement. What conflict did you hear in his statement? Inconsistencies, that was the word. There were inconsistencies in Christopher's interviews. And they play for you the interview with Mr. Stott, 2001, and then they play for you the interview with Detective Shepard in 2021. In one version of those stories, in the 2001 interview, Chris tells that the last time he ever saw Melissa, she was walking down Lee Street by the MARTA station. And he stopped to pick her up, took her up the road to Taco Bell. Apparently she talked about wanting to get back together. He said that was too emotional for him at this point, and he dropped her off back at the train station. She left back north. Lee Street, MARTA station. How far is that from Christopher's house? Because when these new investigators came in 2021 and tried to trip him up with this stuff, all these details from 18 years or 20 years prior, they asked him a specific question. Do you remember telling him the last time you saw her, she was walking down Brookline Street? I'd be a little confused too, because he never said that. Now, whether he remembered the other statement from up Lee Street or not, I don't know. But again, you're 20 years later. Is Christopher the only one in this entire trial that doesn't get a pass on memory when witness after witnesses stand here to say, I can't remember that, I don't recall? At least the police officers get to carry their report with them and read the details and pretend they remembered it. This business about hiding. Oh, Christopher cooperated with police time after time after time. I don't have to list it all tediously again. All the DNA results, the hair, the pubic hair, everything else. Every time time they called him and said, we want this, he showed up. They could have showed up at his door that day. He would have walked out to them. They could have arrested him right there. But they chose to use some kind of SWAT team enforcement with unmarked cars, no lights. If you ever see the video again, you will notice that when those cars pull up, no lights are on. Later in the video, when they're all up in his house, then they have their lights on. They don't turn it on until later. No marks on those cars. The only marked car was all black with black letters. So if you're viewing that coming up your driveway and armed men get out with M16s, what are you going to do? Walk out and greet them? Look, it was rational to fear that, okay? It's rational to be afraid. Imagine if you're seeing that through a home security video and you can have even less resolution. And so in order to connect their stories about domestic violence, to embellish them, and then create a story that somehow leads to a murder, they bring in domestic violence expert. And she tells us what she tells us. Much of which may be valid in certain contexts. And she says, well, if you're leaving, that's a sign of domestic abuse. But if you're returning, we can also explain that as domestic abuse. And if you're at any point in this cycle, virtually any behavior can be explained as part of a cycle of abuse. And Ms. Hilton gave very pointed hypotheticals, clearly designed to apply to this case. And she says, yes, clearly that's domestic abuse. Yes, clearly that's isolating somebody. Yes, clearly that's reconciliation. Yes, yes, yes. No hesitation whatsoever. But when the defense just tweaked the hypothetical just a little bit, her answer was what? Yes? No? No, her answer was, I don't know. I need more facts. I need to know what the abuse situation is. And wait a minute. How can you jump on a hypothetical when she asked it, and when we ask it, we get him hauled around? And it turns out she's a former employee of the DA's office. She's effectively like having an extra prosecutor up there on the stand to hit softballs they throw at her. So what you have happen is you have the state telling you a story that they want you to believe that leads to a murder for which they have no evidence, an act for which they have no evidence, an intent for which they have no evidence, and an unlawful killing for which they have no evidence. They want you to follow their story to judge something based on no evidence. And all the other evidence in the case that points away from Christopher, every bit of hard evidence in the case that points away from Christopher, they spend their time trying to fight against that. Normally the roles are reversed. Normally the state's putting up the hard evidence and the defense has to say, well, that's not right, this is not right, that doesn't apply. But they wanted to, the DNA must have been corrupted because of a rainstorm or whatever. But literally all the evidence points away from Christopher, except for the story. We've been told, or you've been told, that the defense is Carl Patton did. We've never said that. And we've certainly never singled out Carl Patton as the only possibility. share something with you that you're also going to hear in a few minutes. And this again is from the law. An interesting thing the DA said a while ago. He said, they're trying to tell you that Carl Patton did this. But the standard is proof beyond reasonable doubt. They haven't given you proof beyond reasonable doubt that Carl Patton did this. Well, that's not quite how it works. The only person in this room for which the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt applies is the defendant. Any other evidence, you're allowed to determine how you think it may apply. How it may fit the case. And this is the law that she's going to read to you in a minute. Not the law he just told you about. This is the law she's going to read you. Of course, you have to prove everything beyond a reasonable doubt. And in a case like this one, where the only evidence against the defendant is circumstantial, our statutes and our courts have determined that this is how you should interpret beyond a reasonable doubt. You would be authorized to convict only if the evidence, whether direct or circumstantial, or both, excludes all reasonable theories of innocence and proves the guilt of the accused beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, in a case in which there's circumstantial evidence only, you have to exclude every other reasonable possibility. And friends, that's where you do get to use your imagination. I'm not inviting you to come up with Disneyland fairy tales. No, that's vague and arbitrary. That's what the statute outlaws. But if there's any other reasonable possibility to explain the death of Melissa Wolfenbarger, then you must acquit. From the evidence you have, the hard evidence you have remains. You know the area she lived in. You know she was going to Doraville. You know she was riding the train. You know she was getting off that train at midnight and walking from the Lee Street station to Brookline or wherever else she went regularly at night, midnight in the West End. We know she was hanging out with people who were drinking a lot. We know that at least, according to some people in the evidence, some of those people were doing drugs. And when drugs and alcohol are involved in anything, the pool of potential suspects is a chasm. I don't have to find one and bring it to you and say, this guy did it, and I can prove it to you beyond reasonable doubt. You just have to be able to understand it could have been anybody, and that's reasonable. And that's where people like Carl Patton do come in, and Norma Patton. The whole thing about the 5 murders and the dumping bodies in the river and the covering it up for many, many years. But we also find out that one of his victims was a drug dealer that Carl worked for. We also find out that he engaged in contract killing. We also find out that there was a member of their family, in some common law way, whose father Carl had killed. And he didn't find out until sometime later. The same man also hung out in that household, was friends with the Patton family, and later was accused of molesting Melissa. And Norma, and with Melissa's testimony, apparently tried to get him indicted. Does this man have a motive to get revenge against Carl? Yes. Does he have a motive to get revenge against Norma and even Melissa? Yes. Is it reasonable to believe he could have been involved? Absolutely. Is it reasonable to believe that one of her new boyfriends was involved when he found out she had a husband? when he found out or heard a rumor that she was pregnant? Is it reasonably possible that she did find out what her dad had been doing and came to him needing money, came to him with a, I will expose you? Is it possible that living in that area, she got involved in a drug deal gone bad? Why would they dismember her? Dismembering is not, it's not common, but it's not unheard of even in drug dealers. It's a way to dispose of a body. It doesn't have to be ritualistic. You don't have to be Jeffrey Dahmer. And in fact, that's what the state's alleging in this case, that it was merely a means of trying to hide a body. What if she owes somebody a drug debt? Here's a possibility. How do you know that she didn't die of an overdose in somebody's house and they had criminality in their house and they panicked and tried to hide the body? Where's your evidence? It just has to be a reasonable theory. That's what the law says. You can't rule it out. There's not one of these scenarios you can rule out. And if you can't rule it out, that's a reasonable doubt. Maybe she really was pregnant. Maybe she tried to have an unsafe abortion. Where's your evidence, sir? It just has to be a reasonable theory. If the state had done more investigation, maybe we could have eliminated some of these. But we can't. You can't rule these out. Is it possible that destitute, poor, no hope, she did take her own life, and then somebody found her body and tried to get rid of it? Is it possible? The state has not ruled out any of these. It has told you a story about one possibility. It has embellished some of the details and asked you to imagine that it went all the way to a murder. Here's some random thoughts to consider. The bags were found in the wooded area. We heard testimony from Ms. Miller, the investigator who was there, the one state that she found it right by a pathway. Now, why did they even start looking back there? She told you. She told you the owner of that trucking company said, why don't you go look back behind here, because there's a cut through that people use in a wooded area that drug dealers and other people use. That's what she said. She testified to that. And they go back there and start searching, and lo and behold, the dog actually misses it, but she spots this bag right by the trail. And we saw pictures of several of those bags that she described as being in a clearing or on the trail. Not pushed up under the brush. No attempt to hide these things. Those bags were even either thrown there to be found by somebody, or they were just haphazardly thrown there. But the least likely scenario is that someone was taking care to try to hide them. Did somebody kill Melissa and throw it where it would be found, right where Chris worked, to send a message? You can't rule it out. That's a reasonable doubt. expert, spoke about that. Have you considered the evidence we've heard about how Melissa was raised? About how she was locked in a room? How she was, according to Ms. Waddell, stunted in her intellectual development? Unsocial? Very easily controlled, naive? Why is it that when she goes to Kathy's house and she says, I want to turn my children over to you, and then she goes to, writes a letter to Norman and says, no, I want to give all the custody and come see you and stay away from her. Why is it that she talks that way to one side and talks a different way to the other side? Maybe she had a power and control relationship with her mother. Maybe the power and control wheel applies in that relationship too. Maybe when she went up to get her from Brookline and helped her file her police report and helped her go file a protective order, then took her home and helped her took her to Henry County to try to get custody back. Maybe that was exactly what Wendy was telling us. She's easily controlled, and maybe those weren't her own actions. Maybe she was being influenced by the person that used to lock her in a room every day and deprive her and control her. I think it's interesting that the incident happens in 1998, and all of the things in the power control wheel are suddenly in Melissa and Norman's favor, according to their understanding of how the law worked at the time. You remember, I asked her, did you understand that you just go down to the court and say, I want my kids back, and then give your kids back? Now, I know because I'm an attorney and I read the law. Actually, we talked about it here as well in testimony. That's not quite how it works. But Norma testified that that was her understanding and that it was Melissa's understanding at the time. So, what happens? Melissa's with her at that time, not with Chris. Melissa went down and said, I want my kids back. So as far as they understood, they had custody back. They had the physical custody of the kids because they had them at their home at that time for those few days. And they had filed a restraining order against Chris, which would have required him to stay away from it. So according to the power control wheel, everything was in their favor, if that's what Melissa really wanted. If what Norman is telling us in her version of the story is actually true, there would have been no reason to go back to Chris whatsoever. And yet, she goes to her court date and dismisses it. Oh, that's evidence of abuse and power and control. But the power and control was with her mother. She could have easily stood up and said at that time, I'm done. I have everything I want. I don't need you. You can stay away from me. But she didn't. At that moment, she had a choice to go back to Norma Patton or to go back to Chris. And she chose Chris. We're told this sentimental story in Melissa. Last time I talked to her, she said she only wanted one Christmas present. Picture of her and her papa. You've heard no evidence in this case that she ever even hung out with her papa. But you have heard evidence in this case that her papa was a blackout drunk who slept on the couch. It doesn't make sense. You've heard evidence that Tina Patton insisted in 2003 interview with Mr. Calvin that she saw Melissa on her birthday in 1999, that was March 28th, she told Calhoun, she emphasized it over and over, I know I saw her. And she said her mother tried to get her to change the story because it didn't line up with her narrative of when Melissa had died. But if she saw her in March 28th of 1999, we know that Chris stopped working at Action Glass at the beginning of February, and he wasn't living there anymore. It's interesting to me that Mr. Calhoun testified that no, Christopher's property was never searched by dogs. They weren't allowed to search. He sat there confidently and told me. Sergeant Lacoste got on the stand the next day, and not even from our questioning, from their questioning, volunteered the fact that, yeah, there had been a dog search, and I was there, and yes, they did search the property, and they found nothing. Do you remember Miss Cooley talking about, oh, he built a concrete pad in the back? Why bring that evidence in? Except to create an insinuation, oh, he had told somebody allegedly at Waffle House one time about that's how you hide a body. You put it under the foundation of a house and say, well, he made his own little foundation in the back. And ooh, her torso's underneath there. Well, the dogs didn't find it. So whatever that evidence purpose was, like all the other hard evidence, doesn't point to Chris. Mr. Shepard emphasized to us about the importance of the workplace proximity. This also came up during Mr. Stein's testimony, and it's been emphasized by the DAs over and over again. Showing you the map, showing you the dot on the map where it's at, and right here's Christopher's workplace. You've seen that probably 5 or 10 times, and you've heard testimony about it. And Detective Shepard gets up and drives that point home saying, well, it's more likely that that's where the body was hidden because he didn't have to carry it very far. It's right there. And you heard this testimony about how they went out to the scene and they took the podcasters with them, and they took the media with them, and they took DAs with them, and they had this big publicity stunt about, oh, here's where the head was, and right there is his place of work. I almost expect to hear the dum-dum-dum music in the background. And then you learn about Carl Patton's murders. He killed people in his living room, wrapped them up in a camper out back, and then drove them 30 miles to dump them in a river. Proximity is not proof of who did it. And the medical examiner, Dr. Terry, brilliant Dr. Terry, the one I was afraid to object to her qualification. Brilliant, fascinating to talk to. Examined Melissa's remains and made a conclusion that supports my argument. Cause of death is undetermined. Well, there was just she said concealment of remains. I think that's a little argumentative. That is a little argumentative. Because she doesn't know if it was bagged for the purpose of concealing or just disposed or just transporting to be disposed. She doesn't know the intent of the person who bagged it. She can't testify to that. But there was decomposition, true, and there was incomplete discovery of the remains. her conclusion is, I can't determine how she died. And Mr. Fawcett asked her a series of questions. Can you tell if it was strangulation? Can't. Can you tell if it was stabbing? No. Can you tell if it was shooting? No. Can you tell if it was poison? No. And I want you to interpret what that really means, what they're really saying. Can you determine if she was stabbed to death? No. What that sentence really means is we have no evidence she was stabbed. Can you determine if she was poisoned? No. What that evidence really means is we have no evidence she was poisoned. Can you determine if she was beaten to death? No. We have no evidence she was beaten to death. You have no evidence of a murderous act. You have no evidence of malice being formed, whether in an instant or at some point before. You have no evidence of murderous intent. Well, but it was very likely unnatural. I can authoritatively say that as a medical examiner. This was definitely not a natural death. Very likely not a natural death. You don't need to be a medical examiner to figure that out. Although there are all the scenarios I gave you that you can't rule out, such as overdose. At this point, all the medical examiner can tell you is about post-mortem injuries. You don't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. You may have a suspicion that Christopher did it. That's not enough. You may have a strong suspicion that Christopher did it. That is not enough. You may gravely suspect that Christopher did it. And the judge is going to read you a law here in a minute that says a grave suspicion is not sufficient. You need proof beyond any reasonable doubt that excludes every reasonable alternative. The state's theory is asking you to do a couple of things, and I'm winding up. The first thing it asks you is to ignore all the physical evidence and just listen to our story about domestic abuse. And in doing that, it's asking you to believe this. That man right there is so brilliant, he can pull off a mastermind murder. He didn't leave a shred of DNA. He didn't leave a shred of carpet fiber, hair fiber, pubic hair. He didn't leave a shred of anything that our most powerful forensic machines can pick up. Not one shred. And then was dumb enough to dump the body right by where he was. That doesn't make sense. Melissa was surrounded by criminals, violent criminals, drug users, drug dealers, a dangerous area of town. You heard Miss Rock say, I would not walk the streets there at night by myself. She was beset everywhere she went by those dangers. And yet the state is asking you to believe what they're calling an abuser must necessarily become a murderer. But at the same time, that people we know are murderous somehow turn into angels. You can't believe both those things. And I would ask you not to follow your imagination on either one of you. Don't let the state force you to follow its story, which is imagination. Demand evidence that a murder happened, that an act of murder happened. Demand proof beyond a reasonable doubt that an act happened, that there was intent formed, that the killing was indeed unlawful, and that it was with malice aforethought. And when you get done deliberating, we ask you to return a verdict of not guilty.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott, Ms. Hilton, can y'all come over for just a minute, please? About almost 2 hours, and so I'm going to take just a quick comfort break for you guys and for myself, admittedly, for just about 5 or 10 minutes. And so grab some coffee or whatever it is you want, and then we'll be right back in here to go ahead and finish with the closings. Thank you.